In the final weeks of the Pacific War, when hatred had burned as hot as the tropical sun for nearly 4 years, something extraordinary happened in a forgotten prisoner compound on Okinawa. This is the true story of Sergeant James Nakamura, a Japanese-American soldier who proved that humanity could survive even in war's darkest corners. What he did for a dying enemy nurse would challenge everything his fellow soldiers believed about compassion, loyalty, and what it truly means to serve your country. August 1945. The war in the Pacific was entering its final, brutal chapter. Okinawa had fallen just months earlier after 82 days of hell. The island was now a massive staging ground for the planned invasion of mainland Japan. But scattered across the island were thousands of Japanese prisoners of war, survivors of a conflict that had taught both sides to see each other as something less than human. Among the American forces tasked with managing these prisoners were men who existed between two worlds: the Nisei interpreters, Japanese Americans who spoke the enemy's language while wearing American uniforms. They were the bridge between two nations locked in a death struggle, and they carried a burden few could understand. Sergeant James Nakamura was one of these men. Born in Sacramento, California in 1921, Jim had grown up picking fruit in the Central Valley, attending American schools, playing baseball with white kids who sometimes called him names but mostly just called him Jim. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, Jim was 20 years old, working at his father's grocery store and dreaming of becoming a teacher. Within months, everything changed. His family, along with 120,000 other Japanese Americans, was forced into internment camps. His father's store was sold for pennies on the dollar. His younger sister cried as armed soldiers loaded them onto buses headed for Manzanar, a desolate camp in the California desert surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. But Jim made a different choice. When the army began recruiting Nisei soldiers, he volunteered. His father was furious, calling him a fool for serving a country that had imprisoned his own family. His mother just held him and wept. Jim couldn't explain it fully even to himself, but he felt he had to prove something. That he was American. That he belonged. That loyalty meant something even when it wasn't returned. So he shipped out to language school, then to the Pacific, where he would spend the next 3 years translating intercepted messages, interrogating prisoners, and trying to convince battle-hardened Marines that he wasn't the enemy, despite his face. By August 1945, Jim had seen things that hollowed him out inside. He'd translated the final letters of Japanese soldiers who chose suicide over surrender. He'd watched American boys, some younger than his sister, die screaming in the mud. He'd interrogated teenage Japanese prisoners so terrified they wet themselves, and he'd seen his own countrymen spit at his feet despite the sergeant's stripes on his sleeve. The idealism that had driven him to volunteer had been burned away, leaving only a mechanical sense of duty. He did his job. He survived. He tried not to feel too much. On August 14th, Jim was assigned to a prisoner processing facility on the outskirts of Naha, Okinawa's devastated capital. The facility was a collection of damaged warehouses and hastily erected tents, surrounded by barbed wire, and guarded by exhausted soldiers who just wanted to go home. Inside were approximately 300 Japanese prisoners, mostly soldiers, but also some civilians and a handful of military nurses who had been captured when their field hospital was overrun. The conditions were grim. Food was scarce. Medical supplies were prioritized for American casualties. The prisoners existed in a state of limbo, uncertain if they would be executed, repatriated, or simply left to rot. Jim arrived with his friend and fellow Nisei interpreter, Corporal Kenji Yamamoto. Kenji was from Los Angeles, sharper and more cynical than Jim. While Jim still clung to some belief that their service mattered, Kenji had stopped caring months ago. As they walked through the compound, Kenji muttered in English so the prisoners couldn't understand. "Look at this place, Jim. We're babysitting the enemy while our families are still locked up back home. You think any of these white boys are going to thank us when this is over? We're just useful Japs to them. That's all we'll ever be." Jim didn't respond. He'd heard it all before. Besides, Kenji wasn't wrong. But what else could they do? They had made their choice. They had to see it through. Their assignment that day was to conduct medical assessments of the prisoners and identify anyone requiring urgent treatment. The camp's senior medical officer, Captain William Crawford, a 48-year-old surgeon from Texas, made it clear he wasn't enthusiastic about the task. Crawford was a career Army man, weathered and hard, with pale blue eyes that had seen too much death. He'd been at Guadalcanal, Tarawa, and Iwo Jima, and he'd operated on boys with their intestines hanging out, amputated limbs with handsaws when morphine ran out, and watched good men die because there simply weren't enough hands or hours in the day. Crawford had no love for the Japanese. He'd seen what their soldiers did to captured Marines. He'd treated men who'd been tortured, mutilated, left to die in cages. To Crawford, every Japanese prisoner was complicit in that cruelty. When Jim and Kenji reported to his tent, Crawford barely looked up from his paperwork. "You two the interpreters? Fine. We've got about 300 prisoners. Most of them are ambulatory. Focus on anyone who looks like they might die in the next 48 hours. We don't have the resources to play Florence Nightingale to the whole damn Imperial Army. Clear?" Jim nodded. "Yes, sir. We'll prioritize critical cases." Crawford finally looked at him, his gaze cold. "Just so we understand each other, Sergeant. I don't care that you speak their language. I don't care about your story. You do your job, I'll do mine, and maybe we all get to go home. But don't expect me to shed tears over any of these people. They made their choice when they started this war." The assessment began in the sweltering heat of mid-afternoon. Jim and Kenji moved through the rows of prisoners, accompanied by Captain Crawford and a young private named Tommy Sullivan, a 19-year-old from Brooklyn, who'd arrived in Okinawa just 3 weeks earlier. Tommy had soft features and nervous eyes. He carried a medical kit and tried hard not to stare at the prisoners, most of whom sat in silent groups, their eyes hollow with defeat and fear. Jim conducted brief interviews in Japanese, asking about injuries, illnesses, and chronic conditions. Most prisoners were malnourished and dehydrated, suffering from dysentery, infected wounds, or the lingering effects of combat trauma. Crawford examined them with clinical efficiency, his face betraying no emotion. He would nod or grunt, occasionally ordering Tommy to distribute water or basic first aid supplies. Hours passed. The sun began its descent toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the compound. They had processed nearly 200 prisoners when Jim noticed something. In the far corner of the compound, separated from the main group, was a small warehouse with a partially collapsed roof. Jim asked one of the prisoners about it. The man, a skeletal soldier with a bandaged head, replied quietly in Japanese, "That building. Some wounded are kept there, the ones who cannot walk. The nurses tried to care for them, but there is nothing left to give." Jim translated for Crawford. The captain frowned. "Wounded who can't walk? Why wasn't I informed about this?" He turned to a nearby guard, a corporal with a sunburned face. "You know about wounded prisoners in that building?" The corporal shrugged. "Yes, sir. There's maybe a dozen in there, mostly unconscious or delirious. The Jap nurses were tending to them, but one of the nurses got sick herself a few days ago. Honestly, sir, we figured most of them would be dead by now. Didn't seem worth bothering you about." Crawford's jaw tightened. "Take me there. Now." They approached the warehouse. The smell hit them first, a nauseating mixture of infected flesh, human waste, and death. Tommy gagged and covered his mouth. Kenji muttered a curse. Crawford's expression didn't change. He'd smelled worse. Jim steeled himself and followed the captain inside. The interior was dim, lit only by cracks in the walls and roof. The floor was concrete, stained and filthy. Scattered across the space were 11 Japanese soldiers in various states of dying. Some lay on torn blankets, others directly on the concrete. A few were conscious, their eyes tracking the Americans with dull fear. Most were still. 2 were clearly already dead. And in the corner, collapsed against a wooden crate, was a young woman in the tattered remains of a Japanese army nurse's uniform. Her face was pale, her breathing shallow, her eyes were closed. Jim approached carefully and knelt beside her. He spoke softly in Japanese. "Can you hear me? We're here to help." No response. Jim gently touched her shoulder. She flinched but didn't open her eyes. He noticed her uniform was stuck to her back, the fabric crusted with dried blood and pus. The smell was overwhelming. Jim looked up at Crawford. "Sir, this nurse needs immediate attention. Her back is severely infected." Crawford came over and crouched down. He reached out to examine her, then hesitated. He'd seen infections like this before. If the wound was as bad as it smelled, touching her without proper sterile equipment could spread the infection or cause excruciating pain. He stood up. "We need to get her to the medical tent. Sullivan, find a stretcher." But as Tommy turned to leave, Jim noticed something. The nurse's breathing had become more labored. Her lips were cracked and bleeding. She was dehydrated, feverish, and fading fast. Moving her in this condition, across the compound in the heat, might kill her. Jim looked at the wound on her back again. The infection was advanced. The pus and necrotic tissue needed to be cleaned, or she wouldn't survive the night. He made a decision. Jim stood and removed his field jacket. Kenji stared at him. "Jim, what are you doing?" Jim didn't answer. He turned to Tommy. "Private, I need you to boil water. Clean water. As much as you can, as fast as you can." Crawford frowned. "Sergeant, what are you planning?" Jim met the captain's eyes. "Sir, if we move her now, she'll die. That wound needs to be debrided and cleaned immediately. I'm going to do it here." Crawford's expression hardened. "You're not a medic, Sergeant. You're an interpreter. I grew up helping my mother treat farm workers who couldn't afford doctors, sir. I know how to clean a wound, and I speak her language. If she wakes up in pain, I can calm her." For a long moment, Crawford said nothing. Then he nodded slowly. "Fine, but if she dies, it's on you. Sullivan, get that water boiling. I'll supervise." Over the next hour, Jim worked with a focus he hadn't felt in months. Tommy returned with a canteen of boiled water, still steaming. Jim let it cool slightly, then carefully began to pour it over the nurse's back. The moment the hot water touched her infected wounds, she screamed, a raw, agonized sound that echoed through the warehouse. Jim spoke to her softly in Japanese, his voice steady. "I know it hurts. I'm sorry. But this will save your life. Please, trust me." She writhed, trying to pull away, but she was too weak. Jim continued, gently but firmly, washing away the pus and dead tissue. The water ran dark with blood and infection. Crawford watched, his face unreadable. Kenji stood nearby, silent. Tommy looked away, his hands shaking. The other prisoners in the warehouse, those still conscious, watched with wide eyes. One of them, an older soldier with a missing arm, whispered in Japanese, "Why is he helping her? He's the enemy." Jim heard him but didn't stop. He poured more water, cleaned more carefully, his hands gentle despite the horror of the wound. Slowly, the infection began to clear. The nurse's screams faded to whimpers, then to labored breathing. Jim used strips of clean cloth from his own pack to create a makeshift bandage. When he was finally done, he sat back, exhausted. His hands were covered in blood and pus. His uniform was soaked with sweat. But the nurse was still breathing. Her fever seemed to have broken slightly. She would need antibiotics, proper care, but she had a chance now. Crawford stared at Jim for a long moment. Then he turned to Tommy. "Get a stretcher. We're taking her to the medical tent. I'll treat her there." As Tommy hurried off, Crawford looked back at Jim. "Why did you do that, Sergeant?" Jim was silent for a moment, then he spoke quietly. "Because no one else spoke her language, sir." Crawford's eyes narrowed. "That's not what I meant. She's the enemy. You didn't have to risk infection, waste time, or use your own supplies, so why?" Jim looked at the nurse, her face still pale but no longer gray with impending death. "Because she's a nurse, sir. She spent this war trying to save lives, just like you. And because if I stop seeing the humanity in people, even enemies, then what am I fighting for?" Crawford didn't respond. He just turned and walked out of the warehouse. But something had shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor of hatred and exhaustion. Tommy returned with the stretcher, and they carefully moved the nurse to the medical tent. Over the next 3 days, Crawford personally oversaw her treatment. He administered antibiotics, changed her bandages, and ensured she received adequate food and water. He didn't explain why. He didn't have to. On August 18th, 4 days after Jim had saved her life, the nurse regained full consciousness. Jim was called to translate. When he entered the medical tent, she was sitting up, her back properly bandaged, her eyes clear. She looked at him and spoke in Japanese, her voice weak but steady. "You are the one who helped me. They told me." "Why did you do it?" Jim sat down beside her bed. "Because it was the right thing to do." She studied his face. "You are Japanese, but you wear their uniform. I'm American. But yes, my parents were born in Japan." She was quiet for a moment. "I do not understand your war, American son, but I understand kindness. Thank you." Jim nodded. "What's your name?" "Yuki. Yuki Matsumoto. I am from Hiroshima." Jim's breath caught. 3 days earlier, on August 15th, news had reached Okinawa that Japan had surrendered. The war was over. And the reason for that surrender was a weapon beyond comprehension. A single bomb that had destroyed an entire city. Hiroshima. Jim didn't know how to tell her. He didn't know if her family had survived. So he just said, "The war is over, Yuki. You're going to be okay." Tears filled her eyes. "My family?" Jim couldn't answer. He just held her hand. In the weeks that followed, as the full horror of Hiroshima and Nagasaki became known, as the occupation of Japan began, and as the world tried to comprehend what had just happened, Jim's story spread quietly through the ranks. Private Tommy Sullivan told it to his buddies. Captain Crawford mentioned it in a report. Other Nisei interpreters heard about it and felt a flicker of pride, of validation. Sergeant James Nakamura, a man whose own country had imprisoned his family, had chosen compassion over hatred. He had seen an enemy nurse dying in filth and had done what no one else would do. He had boiled water with his own hands and poured it over her wounds, enduring her screams, because it was right. Years later, when Jim returned to California, his family was released from Manzanar. His father never fully forgave him for enlisting. But his mother hugged him and whispered, "You did what you thought was right. That's all any of us can do." Jim became a teacher, just as he'd dreamed. He rarely spoke about the war, but on the wall of his classroom, he kept a single photograph, taken in September 1945. It showed him standing beside Yuki Matsumoto, who had survived and eventually returned to Japan. On the back of the photograph, in Japanese, she had written, "To the American who reminded me that kindness has no nationality. Thank you for my life." Jim would look at that photograph sometimes when his students asked him about the war, about what it meant to be Japanese American, about how to navigate a world that often demanded you choose between identities. And he would tell them the truth, that he had been angry, conflicted, and broken by war, but in a warehouse on Okinawa, pouring boiling water onto the wounds of a dying enemy, he had found something he thought he'd lost, his humanity. And in doing so, he had proven that even in war's darkest hours, compassion could survive. That speaking someone's language meant more than just words. It meant seeing them as human, and that, in the end, was the only language that truly mattered. The story of Sergeant James Nakamura and Nurse Yuki Matsumoto became a quiet legend among the Nisei veterans. It was never headline news. No medals were awarded, but it represented something profound. The men who fought for a country that doubted them, who bridged two cultures in the middle of a brutal war, had proven that loyalty and compassion were not weaknesses, but strengths, that the ability to see humanity in the enemy, to act with mercy when hatred would have been easier, was the truest form of courage. Jim lived until 1998, teaching history in Sacramento for 43 years. He watched as Japanese Americans slowly gained recognition for their service, as the internment camps were officially acknowledged as a grave injustice, and as the 402nd Regimental Combat Team, composed entirely of Nisei soldiers, became the most decorated unit in American military history. He attended reunions with other Nisei veterans, men who had carried the same burden, the same split identity, the same desperate need to prove themselves. They would share stories, laugh at old memories, and sometimes in quiet moments they would talk about the prisoners they had helped, the small acts of mercy they had extended when no one was watching. Yuki Matsumoto survived the war and returned to Hiroshima in late 1945. Her family's home had been vaporized in the atomic blast, but her parents and younger brother had been visiting relatives in the countryside that day. They survived. Yuki spent the rest of her life working as a nurse in Hiroshima's reconstruction hospitals, treating hibakusha, the survivors of the atomic bomb, many of whom suffered from radiation sickness and lifelong trauma. She never married. She dedicated herself entirely to healing. In the 1970s, when relations between Japan and America had thawed, she wrote a letter to the U.S. Army, trying to find the Nisei soldier who had saved her life. It took 3 years, but eventually, the letter reached Jim. They corresponded for over 2 decades, exchanging letters about their lives, their memories of the war, and their shared belief that humanity could transcend even the deepest hatreds. In 1985, on the 40th anniversary of the war's end, Yuki traveled to California. She was 62 years old, her hair gray, her hands still steady from decades of nursing. Jim met her at the airport. They embraced like old friends, though they had only spent a few days together 4 decades earlier. Jim's wife, Mary, a third-generation Japanese-American he had met in the internment camp, welcomed Yuki into their home. Over dinner, Yuki told Jim's children and grandchildren about the day their grandfather had saved her life. She described the warehouse, the smell of death, the unbearable pain of the boiling water on her infected back, and the gentle voice speaking Japanese, telling her to hold on, that she would survive. She described waking days later to find that the war was over, that her city was gone, but that she was alive because a stranger had chosen mercy. Jim's grandchildren listened, wide-eyed. They had known their grandfather was a veteran, but he rarely spoke about the war in detail. Now they understood why. The war had been hell, but in that hell, their grandfather had found a way to remain human. Captain William Crawford also survived the war. He returned to Texas, resumed his medical practice, and tried to forget the things he had seen. But he couldn't forget the Nisei sergeant who had knelt in filth to save an enemy nurse. In 1952, Crawford wrote a letter to the Department of Defense, recommending Jim for a commendation. The letter was filed away and forgotten, lost in the bureaucratic shuffle of post-war America. But Crawford kept a copy. When he died in 1979, his daughter found the letter among his possessions, along with a journal entry from August 1945. It read, "Today I watched a man I had dismissed as just another Jap prove that he was more American than most of us. He showed mercy when I had none left to give. I don't know if that makes him a hero, but it makes him a better man than me. Maybe that's what we should have been fighting for all along. Not victory, but the chance to remain decent." Private Tommy Sullivan, the young soldier from Brooklyn who had witnessed Jim's act of compassion, carried the story with him for the rest of his life. He became a school teacher in New York, and every year, on the anniversary of Japan's surrender, he would tell his students about Sergeant Nakamura. He would describe the warehouse, the dying nurse, and the Nisei soldier who had removed his jacket, boiled water, and poured it over her wounds while speaking softly in a language the enemy could understand. Tommy would tell his students that war was terrible, but that even in war, individuals could choose kindness. That humanity was not a weakness to be discarded in times of crisis, but a strength to be protected at all costs. Corporal Kenji Yamamoto, Jim's cynical friend, also survived. He returned to Los Angeles, worked as a mechanic, and spent years angry at the country that had used him and discarded him. But in 1988, when President Ronald Reagan signed the Civil Liberties Act, formally apologizing for the internment of Japanese Americans and providing reparations to survivors, Kenji wept. He called Jim that night. "Maybe it meant something after all, Jim. What we did. Maybe people will remember." Jim replied quietly, "They'll remember if we tell them, Kenji. That's our job now, to make sure they remember." The story of the Nisei interpreters and soldiers like Jim Nakamura is not widely known. They served in the shadows, translating intercepted messages, interrogating prisoners, and risking their lives in a war against a country that looked like them. They were called Japs by their own comrades, suspected of disloyalty, and denied basic recognition for decades. But they served anyway. They proved their loyalty not with words, but with actions. And in doing so, they helped win the war in the Pacific. Without the Nisei linguists, American forces would have been blind to Japanese strategy, unable to communicate with prisoners, and ignorant of critical intelligence. The Nisei were essential, but for years they were invisible. Jim Nakamura's act in that warehouse on Okinawa was not unique. Across the Pacific, other Nisei soldiers performed similar acts of mercy, treating enemy wounded, protecting prisoners from abuse, and reminding their fellow Americans that the Japanese were human beings, not monsters. These acts were rarely recorded, almost never celebrated, but they represented the best of what America claimed to stand for. The idea that all people, regardless of race or nationality, deserved dignity and compassion, that even in war there were lines that should not be crossed, that mercy was not weakness but the highest form of strength. In 1998, when Jim passed away at the age of 77, his funeral was attended by hundreds of people, former students, fellow Nisei veterans, and even a few former Japanese prisoners of war who had immigrated to America and tracked him down over the years. Yuki Matsumoto, now 75 and frail, flew from Hiroshima to attend. She placed a single white chrysanthemum on his casket and whispered in Japanese, "Rest now, my friend. You carried your burden with grace." The eulogy was delivered by Jim's oldest grandson, a lawyer in San Francisco. He spoke about his grandfather's life, his service, and the photograph on the classroom wall. He ended with these words, "My grandfather taught me that being American is not about where you were born or what you look like. It's about what you do when no one is watching. It's about choosing compassion when hatred would be easier. It's about speaking the language of humanity, even when the world demands you speak the language of war." That was his legacy, and it's a legacy worth remembering. Today, the story of Sergeant James Nakamura is preserved in the archives of the Japanese American National Museum in Los Angeles. The photograph of him with Yuki Matsumoto hangs in the museum's permanent exhibition on Nisei soldiers. Visitors from around the world stop to read the caption, to learn about the man who poured boiling water on an enemy nurse's back, not to torture her, but to save her life. It's a small story in the grand sweep of World War II, a footnote in the history of the Pacific Theater. But it's a story that matters, because it reminds us that even in humanity's darkest hours, individuals can choose light. That compassion is not naive or weak, but radical and brave. And that sometimes the most heroic thing you can do is see the humanity in someone the world has told you to hate. The Nisei soldiers of World War II fought two wars, one against the Axis powers, and one against the prejudice and suspicion of their own country. They won both, not with violence but with quiet dignity, unshakable loyalty, and acts of mercy that proved their character beyond any doubt. Sergeant James Nakamura, kneeling in a filthy warehouse on Okinawa, pouring boiling water over the infected wounds of a dying enemy nurse, was not thinking about history or legacy. He was just doing what he believed was right. But in doing so, he became a symbol of everything the Nisei represented: courage, compassion, and an unwavering belief that humanity transcends nationality. So if you found this story meaningful, if it reminded you that even in our divided world, compassion still matters, then honor Jim's legacy. Subscribe to this channel to hear more untold stories of courage and humanity. Leave a comment sharing how this story impacted you. And most importantly, carry this lesson forward. Speak the language of humanity. Choose mercy over hatred. And never forget that the truest measure of a person is not how they treat their friends, but how they treat their enemies. Because in the end, that's what separates us from the darkness. That's what makes us human.